Jake Gray had always been a man of ambition and dreams. The kind of person who believed that hard work and loyalty would lead him to happiness. He had built his life from the ground up, determined to make something of himself. At the age of 32, he had already achieved many of the goals he'd set for himself. A steady job as a manager at a leading tech company, a beautiful home in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, and a relationship with Kelly, who had been his partner for 6 years. In every way, Jake had the life that most people would envy. Kelly, with her bright smile and radiant energy, had been the love of his life. Together, they had navigated the ups and downs, and he always believed that their bond was unbreakable. She was his rock, his confidant, and in his mind, there was no one else who could ever compare to her. They had talked about starting a family, about growing old together, and the thought of spending forever with her filled him with warmth. But there was a subtle undercurrent to their relationship, something Jake had chosen to ignore, at least until it was too late. Kelly had always been a bit elusive about certain things. She'd say she was busy with work, or that the timing wasn't right for kids. Jake had tried to understand, even though deep down he had always wanted a family. Still, he trusted her, believed her when she said she needed more time. After all, they had everything else: love, laughter, security. What more did they need? It was during the lead-up to the company's Christmas party that the cracks in Jake's perfect world began to show. Kelly was particularly enthusiastic about the event this year. She spent hours getting ready, carefully choosing her outfit, even asking for Jake's opinion multiple times. Jake, oblivious to the brewing storm, told her how stunning she looked, as he always did. She was a picture of grace and beauty, and he felt an immense sense of pride walking into the party with her on his arm. But as the night wore on, a growing sense of unease began to settle in Jake's chest. Kelly, usually so attached to him at these events, was more distant than usual. She seemed to be laughing a little too much with certain colleagues, men who Jake didn't know that well. He brushed it off at first. After all, it was just a party. But when he saw her talking closely with Jim Stevens, one of his colleagues, something in Jake's gut twisted. Jim had always been charming, too charming, in Jake's opinion. He often flirted with Kelly, and Jake had dismissed it as harmless. He trusted Kelly completely, never imagining that she might be interested in someone else. But as the evening progressed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He caught glimpses of Kelly and Jim sharing private conversations, whispering to each other in corners of the room, laughing a little too intimately. Jake tried to focus on his own conversations, but it was hard to ignore the sinking feeling growing inside him. By the time the evening began to wind down, Jake excused himself to the restroom. But as he walked through the hallway to the men's room, he stopped in his tracks. Through the open conference room door, he saw them, Kelly and Jim. She was laughing, her hand lightly brushing his arm. It seemed innocent at first, but then Jim leaned in close, and Jake's breath caught in his throat as he saw the way Kelly responded. They were close, so close. Too close. The door creaked loudly as Jake instinctively stepped closer. His heart raced in his chest, the blood draining from his face. He was about to turn and leave when the unmistakable sound of a kiss reached his ears. It was as if time stood still. Jake's feet felt rooted to the ground. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Kelly, his wife, was in the arms of another man. Her lips locked with Jim's, and she didn't pull away. It was a betrayal so pure, so devastating, that Jake's world tilted beneath him. In that moment, Jake couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His mind went numb, and every ounce of his being screamed at him to turn away, to flee. But he couldn't tear his eyes from the scene before him. The woman he loved, his best friend, his confidant, the one he had built his future with, was betraying him in the most intimate way possible. And then Jim noticed him. Jim's smug grin never faltered as he pulled away from Kelly and saw Jake standing in the doorway. Kelly froze, her eyes wide with panic, as she quickly stepped back from Jim, trying to compose herself. But Jake had already seen everything. The damage had been done. Kelly opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jim, however, was unfazed. He straightened up, flashing Jake a look that almost seemed smug, as if he had no regrets. It was almost as if he had been waiting for this moment, a sense of entitlement emanating from his every movement. "Jake, Kelly began, but Jake held up his hand to stop her. "No, don't," Jake said quietly, his voice trembling with anger. "Don't say anything." His mind was racing. 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 questions swirled inside him, but all he could feel was the gut-wrenching pain that gripped his heart. He had trusted Kelly with everything. She was the one person he thought would never hurt him, never betray him. But she had, and now everything was in ruins. "You don't need to explain, Kelly," Jake continued, his voice growing louder, his anger building. "I've seen enough." Kelly's face flushed, her eyes beginning to tear up. She reached out, but Jake took a step back, as if her touch burned him. He couldn't stand to be near her. "This is how it ends, Kelly," Jake said, his voice hard as stone. "I'm done. We're done." He didn't wait for her response. He didn't care what she had to say. Jake turned on his heel and stormed out of the conference room, leaving Kelly behind, alone with her guilt. The drive home that night was a blur. Jake could hardly see through the tears that welled up in his eyes. He had no idea how he managed to get home, how he ended up standing in the middle of his own living room. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. He had no idea where to go from here. Kelly moved out the very next day, taking only what she could carry. She didn't try to fight him, didn't try to apologize. She knew, deep down, that she had destroyed everything. The house, which had once been filled with laughter and love, was now silent. The divorce was finalized quickly. It was painful, but Jake didn't want to linger in the heartbreak. He wanted to move on. He couldn't spend another second looking back at the woman who had torn his heart apart. It didn't matter how much he had once loved her. She was gone, and so was his trust in people. But even as he moved through the motions of life, the pain never fully left him. Each day was a battle. He had to rebuild himself from the inside out. He focused on his career, but his heart was heavy with the weight of betrayal. He started therapy to help him process his emotions, but no amount of talking would change what had happened. Months passed, and Jake slowly began to rebuild his life. He found solace in his work, poured himself into projects that made him feel accomplished. But when the nights grew long and quiet and the memories of Kelly and Jim resurfaced, he couldn't help but feel the hollow ache of loss. Jake's journey from that moment forward was not easy. He fought with every fiber of his being to reclaim his sense of self, to forgive himself for the trust he had given to someone who didn't deserve it. The pain of betrayal didn't fade quickly, but over time, Jake learned that the greatest act of revenge was not vengeance. It was finding peace within himself. Kelly, on the other hand, eventually left the city. Jim, who had never cared about her beyond the brief affair, moved on as well. They were ghosts of Jake's past, fading into memories that he would never forget, but could eventually live without. In the end, Jake Gray emerged stronger. He learned to trust again, not in people, but in himself. He learned that his worth was not defined by others, and that the greatest love he could offer was to himself. And though the scars of the past would never fully heal, they no longer controlled him. Jake had found his way back to peace.